entail God's being committed to abrogating the sixth commandment. Suppose Abraham could know, did in fact know, that God had commanded the sacrifice of Isaac. Would he then be morally obligated to do it? Could his obligation to God override his duty not to kill? One might suppose so if one thought that obedience to God is an indefeasible moral duty. But why should we suppose that? I can think of two possibilities. One, that we have an absolute duty of obedience to the one who created us, and two, that a strong, voluntarist, divine command theory is true, one that fully endorses the claim that God is free to command whatever actions it is logically and physically possible for human beings to perform, and that the rightness of an action consists in nothing beyond conformity to God's command. A strong divine command theory should be unpalatable to all morally sensitive Christians who are mindful of its consequences and fully aware of the biblical horrors. But the same consequences follow from the view that, even if moral norms generally are grounded in something other than the divine will, obedience to that will trumps any other conflicting moral demand. What could be the basis for such a claim? What grounds an absolute duty to obey one's Creator? It could not be, on pain of begging the question at issue, that God commands such indefeasible obedience. Nor is it at all apparent how else such a claim could be supported, except on the independent assumption that God always commands what is right, which is, again, precisely at issue in the Akedah and other horrors. However, there remains a possibility. Perhaps Abraham's duty to obey God is not an ethical duty, but a religious duty, where religious duties are sui generis, and not a species of ethical duty. Quinn himself suggests this possibility. It may be implicit in Kierkegaard's, or more carefully, Johannes de Silentio's, notion of the teleological suspension of the ethical. Now, the possibility that there may be religious duties distinct from ethical ones is not particularly hard to grasp. But that there could be religious duties that conflict with and supersede ethical duties is difficult to understand. It appears flatly to conflict with the traditional view that God is essentially good. And indeed, Johannes de Silentio is reduced to silence by Abraham's deed. He does not pretend to understand the night of faith. Neither in the end do I. Yet Abraham, as Kierkegaard circles around him, appears to be an attractive figure. We cannot take our eyes off of him. What we should make of this, I am not sure. It would, however, provoke a prolonged meditation. What I will say is this. Kierkegaard affects us because of his seriousness, his honesty, and the depth of his psychological insights. His efforts to plumb Abraham's depths therefore deserve respect, even if the biblical text remains silent, and even if de Silentio's Abraham may have little connection to the figure of the Genesis 22, little connection to the figure the author of Genesis 22 wanted to portray. Kierkegaard moves us so powerfully in Fear and Trembling, not only because of his extraordinary skill as a writer and seriousness as a thinker, but because of the depth of the tragic sensibility with which he faces the human condition. But it is in Abraham really a kind of inversion of the tragic. The tragic hero suffers social or corporeal shipwreck because he will stop at nothing in his defiance of a morally unjust divine order. The knight of faith risks moral chaos because he will stop at nothing to obey the decrees of an incomprehensible God. The great figures of the ancient tragedies were heroic because they rebelled against the unjust fate decreed by the gods. The tragedy of Abraham is that he does not rebel. It is surprising, then, that Locke should advocate in defense of Scripture a necessary condition on revelation that he must have known much of the Bible could not meet. I'll skip a paragraph here. One response to the difficulty, not uncommon during the Enlightenment, was to edit the sacred text, gerrymandering away the moral repugnancies. But that is not only artificial from a literary perspective, it damages too much of the text. much more fruitful if what interests us is an explanation of how the books of the Bible were written, is a sociological perspective. My remarks have engaged the kind of Jewish and Christian tradition that sees God in his heaven inspiring specially chosen individuals to communicate his will. But instead, one can approach these texts as cultural artifacts of an ancient tribal people who were deeply concerned to forge and perpetuate their sense of political identity by means of stories of origin and destiny, stories that served to express and justify the legitimacy of their social order and, in Israel's case, their right to a specified territory. Such an approach not only helps us to understand the moral failures of the Tanakh and the New Testament, but permits us to situate our understanding within the broad context of ancient Near Eastern culture and ultimately human nature at large. We can thereby understand the demonization of enemies, the exaggeration of battle casualties, and the cloak of divine favor that attends home team success, as well as the serious wrestling with questions of morality and social order. Of course, this explanatory strategy can be fleshed out in many different ways, but I believe it can help us understand difficult cases. For example, the sociological approach makes it possible to explain how Jesus could have sensibly preached both love of enemies and hatred of one's family, a disparity that has produced some tortured Christian interpretations. But such an approach can hardly avoid rendering implausible the view that the Bible is divinely inspired. Where does this leave those unwilling to abandon that doctrine? The believer can, to be sure, retreat at this point to a strong divine command theory and preserve the sanctity of Scripture by deeming the horrors of the Bible to be righteous simply by virtue of their conformity with God's will. But the price of this rescue is high. It requires abdicating the moral high ground from which Christian apologists have traditionally attacked pagan religions. More importantly, it makes the pursuit of faith an essentially tragic enterprise. Like Father Abraham, we are forced to sacrifice to it our deepest moral convictions and feelings. That price is too high. I've offered an argument from the moral knowledge we share to the conclusion that any sacred text that is morally depraved is either no genuine revelation at all or reveals the character of a God unworthy of worship. Such a God is, moreover, not merely unworthy of worship, but deserving of moral censure. We have a duty to repudiate such a God. A salvation purchased at the cost of complicity in the deeds of such a God is not a salvation that conscience can abide. The Jewish prayer of mourning makes no mention of the dead. It sings praise of life and Lord. I have chosen instead to name the dead, who still cry from the earth, the men and maidens of Midian, the tortured soul of Isaac, the daughter and son of Jephthah and David, upon whom memory has bestowed no names, the Canaanite babes laid waste in war. Let them be remembered against the God of the Bible. Who is this Lord who swaggers across the firmament, who lectures Job on his puniness to avoid the one confession he owes, that, tempted by Satan, he sinned against Job? Who loves whom he will love and hates whom he will hate? He is not a God I hope to know. I prefer to think the heavens vast and void.
We'll have some comments now from Professor Plantinga.
First, I'd like to thank Evan Fales for his passionate, impassioned, and challenging paper. I have to add that Evan is my friend, and I'm sorry, it pains me to see that he and I are so far apart on this topic. So, Evan Fales offers, quote, an argument from the moral knowledge we share to the conclusion that any sacred text that is morally depraved is either no genuine revelation at all or reveals the character of a God unworthy of worship. Such a God is, moreover, not merely unworthy of worship, but deserving of moral censure, we have a duty to repudiate such a God, unquote. This, though impassioned, is pretty abstract. A Christian might agree, but Fales means to go further. He argues, or at any rate suggests, that Christians who accept the Bible, including the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scripture, as divine revelation, do take as revelation a sacred text that is morally depraved, and do worship a God unworthy of worship. In failing to repudiate, a fortiori in worshiping such a God, they are themselves immoral. This is strong stuff. Fales himself strikes a defiant pose. Who is this Lord that swaggers across the firmament? And the tragedy of Abraham is that he did not rebel. Is this heroically Promethean, or is it foolish hubris?